They arrived in the middle of the night. Thousands of black ships hovered silently over Earth's major cities, blocking out the stars in their wake. At first, no one knew whether these were visitors seeking peaceful contact or invaders with ill intent. Governments ordered their people indoors. Whole towns stood eerily quiet beneath the vehicles' looming silhouettes, disoriented by the immense shadows they cast. In those first days, official spokespeople told the populace to remain calm to await further announcements. Yet all that calm was shattered when the visitors revealed their faces. They were human, or near enough. The strangers claimed to be the vanguard of a lost colony now returning to Earth, but their technology was centuries ahead of anything Earth possessed. Their leader, a man called Marrakesh, introduced himself through a global broadcast that cut into every television channel and streaming feed. Tall, imposing, clad in shimmering silver armor, he looked every bit like a legend from an ancient epic. He spoke of Earth's old heritage, of how his people had once been exiled from the planet centuries prior, forced to find new worlds in the dark corners of the galaxy. He said they had returned to share the spoils of their travels. His words became poison the moment Earth leaders refused to align with him. The first sign of his cruelty arrived when a drone stormed the premises of the European Alliance headquarters. It projected a scorching beam that incinerated the main council chamber, forcing a capitulation within hours. No earthly weapon could penetrate the black hulls of Marrakesh's ships, and soon every continent had lost its capacity for organized defense. What remained were pockets of riotous dissatisfaction, but the resistance lacked the means to strike back effectively against technology so advanced. 2 months after the arrival of Marrakesh, Earth was under new rule. To the world's surprise, in many ways, life continued. With some semblance of normality, at least on the surface, people were allowed to go to their jobs, schools remained open, and certain media outlets were permitted to air. But Marrakesh's new regime demanded unwavering loyalty. His soldiers oversaw daily life with mechanical precision. Political dissent was outlawed, and violators were sent to re-education centers. These facilities, rumored to exist in artificial satellites orbiting Earth, became known as the final place anyone with rebellious ideas would see. Fear became currency. Neighbors wondered who might whisper their names into a watchful ear. Families dreaded a midnight knock at the door. In such an atmosphere of suffocating uncertainty, it was the artists who first began to push back. From hidden enclaves in abandoned theaters, from hushed gatherings in shuttered libraries, a movement began. They were poets, storytellers, and musicians who believed in the power of words. Their gatherings were small at first, secret recitations of verse that lamented Earth's subjugation. It was risky, for every piece of creative expression had to submit to censorship protocols installed by Marrakesh's overseers. Yet the artists found ways around such obstacles. They composed their works on scraps of paper to conceal them from scanning devices. They coded defiance into the structure of their stanzas, embedding hidden messages in the cadences of their narratives. Word spread of a poet named Althea Crane, whose verses circulated in smoky back rooms throughout the ruined neighborhoods of old London. Her poems carried an electric urgency. She wrote of Earth's former wonders, how humankind had once found strength in unity and creativity. She spoke of hope's dawn, of raising voices unafraid. In older poems, intangible and ambiguous references to tyranny felt remote. But in Althea's lines, the imagery of oppression was raw. She did not shy from describing the cruelty of Marrakesh and his enforcers. Her words made the horrors tangible. The battered mansions turned barracks, the ruined farmland, the forced labor on reconstructing highways, once destroyed in the invasion's opening salvos. Althea's words were lithe and subtle. They were coded so that any listener who was willing to look beyond the surface would discover the true message beneath. Resist. Stand firm. There is still freedom in imagination. It began as single lines scrawled in alleyways or within the dusty pages of old books that the censors had overlooked. We must not forget how we once sang our own songs to the sky. That single line sparked quiet conversations among the frightened. People gathered in secret, analyzing every phrase. Soon enough, the lines expanded into entire stanzas. Even as black hulls blot out the sun, the pulse of our hearts cannot be silenced. We stand in the hush of storm dawn, waiting for words that set the horizon aflame. Although Althea's verse was a spark, she was by no means alone. Across the oceans and isolated corners of the planet, other storytellers emerged. Francisco Oran chiseled grand narratives into the walls of abandoned cathedrals in the old Argentine territory. Sankofa Adebayo in West Africa wove stories of ancestral spirits who guided the living toward courage. Mina Song in East Asia recounted legends of mythical warriors with unstoppable resolve. Each voice, distinct in culture and style, still sang out the same call. Endure, persist, fight back with the might of human creativity. At first, Marrakesh's enforcers barely noticed the surge in cultural expression. The new overlords considered themselves beyond the reach of words. They had weaponry that could tear through steel with one silent, precise beam. So what were words to them? Mere ephemeral noises, fleeting and impotent. They lacked the imagination to see how stories, stoked by longing, could unite a desperate population. For a time, the artists continued under this protective cloak of scornful indifference, building an ever larger network of underground audiences. The gatherings became more frequent. It was no longer only poets reciting in secret dens. Entire neighborhoods conspired to hide them. Mysterious signals, bouncing from compromised satellites, distributed coded lines to every corner of the planet. If a family had an old radio, they could tune in during certain hours to hear the faint reading of a new poem. The lines were short but exhilarating, often concluding with a call to meet in certain places, to share resources, to sabotage equipment. Metaphors became instructions. It was a global mosaic of clandestine artistry that seeded real-world rebellion. Inevitably, though, Marrakesh regime awakened to the threat. It happened one evening when Althea Crane dared host an open-air reading in the battered amphitheater of ancient Athens. Over 500 people arrived, quietly in the pre-dawn glow. Some traveled on foot for days to see her speak in person. Others came with battered instruments, as if hoping to accompany her words with chords. Althea, tall and lean, wore a tattered cloak, but there was majesty in her presence. She stood in that sacred space, voice echoing against marble columns that had withstood millennia. As she recited her poem, the hush in the air trembled with possibility. From these stones, once the cradle of reason, now emerges the cry for freedom. We are the children of 1,000 yesterdays, yet hope remains in the seeds we have sown. No empire stands forever in silence. No tyranny remains unbroken. Our words, as mighty as thunder, shall break the chains that bind us. Some in the gathering wept, others raised their fists. Word by word, hearts awakened. It felt like an unstoppable wave was forming, a tide too large to be contained. But the watchers in the sky had sensed the mass convergence. Suddenly a shriek of engines tore across the horizon. 3 black ships descended over the amphitheater and a column of enforcers marched in. The crowd scattered, but many stood their ground, defiant. They had heard Althea's poem. They were emboldened. It was a massacre. The enforcers opened fire with energy pulses designed for crowd control that instead left dozens gravely injured. Althea managed to escape, only because half the crowd threw themselves in front of her, forming a human barrier. She fled into the catacombs beneath the city, but many were captured, including the poet Ariadne, who had traveled with Althea from London. Each she and dozens of others were taken to the orbiting re-education center. The recording of that day's brutality spread across the underground network. Rather than instill fear, it ignited anger. Word by word, poem by poem, the movement grew more resolute. They saw that the regime was afraid enough to use savage force against an unarmed gathering. Soon after, Marrakesh himself spoke in a broadcast that took over every screen. His voice was cold, measured. "You are hereby ordered to relinquish all subversive materials. Poets, storytellers, and ideological agitators are to surrender. Failure to comply will bring consequences you cannot imagine." For many, that broadcast only confirmed what the movement already knew. Their words were hitting the empire's brittle core. A coalition of thinkers, librarians, scholars, and everyday citizens banded together. They were not soldiers. They had few weapons, but they had each other, and they had stories. Their plan was twofold. First, they needed a unifying narrative that every person on Earth could recite, a kind of manifesto of freedom that soared beyond borders. Second, they intended to infiltrate Marrakesh's communication network, to spread that narrative in a single, overwhelming broadcast. For months, rumors circulated that Marrakesh's top engineers had built a data fortress in a hidden server complex near the old city of Bangalore. If that fortress could be breached, the tyrant's own satellites could be turned against him, broadcasting the movement's words across the entire planet. But it was heavily guarded, patrolled by mechanized drones, shimmering force fields, and the fearsome black-armored enforcers. Althea traveled from safe house to safe house, gathering the greatest living minds in secret. With her were Mina Song, Sankofa Adebayo, Francisco Oren, and half a dozen other luminaries, each a legend in their own region. They huddled in an abandoned monastic library carved into the cliffs of Tibet. Beneath flickering lanterns, they crafted a grand poem meant to speak to every human heart. The composition was careful and deliberate, merging the styles and languages from cultures around the globe. It would not be any single tradition story, but a universal call. Their process was arduous. Each line had to resonate across linguistic borders. Each stanza had to unify in spirit. Some lines were in Spanish, followed by lines in Mandarin, Yoruba, Arabic, Hindi, English woven in a tapestry of tongues. Through the short-range communicator that linked them to the underground, they tested lines on pockets of listeners scattered across Earth. Feedback came from ragtag communities who offered amendments and suggestions to ensure it struck the right nerve. At last, they had it. A testament of hope and defiance that captured humankind's longing for liberation. The final words were said to be so powerful that even the most jaded hearts would stir. Then the infiltration began. A group of young engineers, outraged by the crackdown that nearly killed their friends, volunteered to open a path into the server complex. They had once been forced to work there, constructing the Empire's AI systems. These engineers still had their biometric access codes. With that advantage, they could slip through the security gates. If they could travel undetected, a carefully orchestrated diversion was planned. On the outskirts of the city, 2,000 volunteers staged an open protest to draw enforcers away, chanting lines from the earliest rebellious poems. Thousands more joined spontaneously. The enforcers rushed to quell the demonstration, leaving the data fortress more thinly guarded. Under the cover of monsoon rains, Althea, Mina, Francisco, and half a dozen other storytellers accompanied the engineers. Clad in dark ponchos, they navigated flooded streets and rubble until they came to the imposing gates. The engineers' biometric access did indeed open the doors, but silently alarms flashed in a control room deeper inside, alerting watchers to an unusual entry. They moved with haste, disabling cameras with electromagnetic pulses the engineers had cobbled together from stolen equipment. The corridors inside were sterile and white, humming with the drone of countless servers. Armed guards patrolled, so the group split into smaller teams. Each hushed step was a risk. One slip meant capture or death. Down in the complex's lowest levels, behind reinforced doors, lay the core control terminal. It was rumored that from this console, Marrakesh's entire satellite network could be overridden. Once inside, the infiltration team carefully planted a coded data packet that contained the grand poem. When executed, it would hijack every broadcast frequency worldwide. Simultaneously, it would jam the Empire's typical feed. No more threats from Marrakesh's cold visage. Earth would hear only the clarion call of the words that demanded freedom. Just as a young engineer named Leon was about to finalize the upload, klaxons blared through the corridors. Red lights flashed. The infiltration had been discovered. The heavy thud of boots echoed in the distance as guards rushed into the lower levels. Some of the infiltration team moved to barricade the doors. Francisco turned to Althea, his voice shaking with urgency. "Upload it now. We'll hold them off as long as we can." Althea's face was grim but resolute. She pressed her palm to the console. Leon typed rapidly, initiating the final sequence. Already they could hear lasers firing in the corridor. Screams resounded, and the air smelled of seared metal. Althea whispered under her breath, as if summoning the spirit of Earth itself. "We will not kneel." The final prompt blinked. Leon struck the enter key. In the same moment, a detonation rocked the barricade behind them. The guards broke through. The infiltration team had no illusions about escaping unscathed. There was hardly time to flee. One guard, black visor glinting, leveled his rifle. Althea braced for the worst, but the shot never came, because at that instant the entire facility's lights flickered and the overhead screens illuminated with a swirl of colors. A voice resonant, layered, weaving across multiple languages, roared through the speakers. "We, the free hearts, stand at the edge of ruin and choose to remember that every empire that soared too high was brought to ground by the song of its people." It was the poem. The words soared through the corridors, defying the walls of fear. The guards paused, rifles trembling in their hands. They heard it too. In that suspended moment, it was as if time itself took a breath. The infiltration team seized the opportunity to duck through a side passage. A hail of shots rang out, but they continued forward, hearts pounding. Leon staggered from a wound, but Mina and Francisco hoisted him up. They ran, chased by echoes of their own broadcast that now conquered every corridor. Above ground, around the globe, the effect was staggering. Entire city blocks froze, as every loudspeaker and every screen repeated the poem in a loop. Small children heard it for the first time, eyes alight with new understanding. Workers paused at construction sites. Rebels fighting in the outskirts of Paris heard the call and felt renewed strength. Even those who had never cared for poetry listened, transfixed. Something about the merging of languages and the unstoppable urging to rise shimmered with undeniable truth. And in orbit aboard the largest black ship, Marrakesh stood before his command console, seething. With savage determination, he tried to override the broadcast, but the software locks refused him. He reached out to his subordinates, only to find that entire chains of command had collapsed. For the poem did not merely speak. Embedded in it was a subroutine that disabled remote weapon systems. At that moment, Earth's satellite defenses, once turned subservient to Marrakesh, simply powered down or turned against his black ships, bombarding them with code that scrambled guidance protocols. On the surface, the enforcers found themselves isolated. Their leaders were cut off, and many of their weapons ceased to function. As the poem continued to repeat, crowds surged from the shadows. The final lines, carried on 1,000 voices, lit the air like a chorus of thunder. "You who have listened in darkness, now stand in the dawn of your power. Our stories carry the promise that no chain is unbreakable when hearts unite to pen a new chapter of freedom." In that hour, a global uprising began. People overwhelmed the now disorganized occupation forces. Growing pockets of resistance used what few weapons they had or simply the sheer force of numbers. In Melbourne, medics formed a shield around a group of journalists who broadcast images of the crumbling empire. In Cairo, old monuments became rallying points for thousands who sang the poem in Arabic. In Buenos Aires, city squares overflowed with chanting voices, exalting the stanzas that had once been carved into cathedral walls by Francisco. Over the next days, entire platoons of enforcers surrendered, dropping their weapons, confused by the intangible might of words that refused to fade. Above it all, Marrakesh raged. He attempted one last measure, ordering the black ships to incinerate the cities from a distance. Yet the sabotage in the satellites remained absolute, and the ship's systems responded with only error codes. Enraged and desperate, he gave the order to retreat and attempt to seize a new vantage point from which to crush the rebellion. His command crew, however, had had enough. Some outright mutinied, others refused orders in stunned disbelief. That was the final blow. The black ships, with their chain of command shattered, began to drift away from Earth, scattering to the solar system's fringes. The human throngs watched, triumphant, as the once menacing shadows withdrew, leaving the battered planet behind. In the weeks that followed, the new Earth government, the Free Council formed from local community leaders, activists, and of course the poets and storytellers whose words had sparked the revolution, they emphasized unity in diversity, pledging that no new tyranny would replace the old. Althea Crane, who had lost friends in the final conflict, spoke at the first gathering of the Free Council, in a clearing near the remains of ancient Athens. She felt the weight of the lost, of all those who had paid with their lives or their freedom. Yet she also felt the hope that had blossomed like a sunrise over the horizon. "We have witnessed the truth," she said to the assembled crowds. "Words have power. We have seen them set fire to fear and illuminate the path toward justice. Every voice matters. Every story we share is a step toward preserving the freedom we have earned." Her voice carried over the hushed audience. From the back of the crowd, someone spoke in response. "We'll keep telling these stories," a young woman said, her hair still matted with dust from the city's ruins. "We'll write new poems and songs so that the next generation never forgets." Thus a renaissance of creativity and courage took root. The libraries once shuttered reopened with fresh volumes of verse and narrative. Gutted museums were restored. New forms of art flourished, forging unity from the patchwork of Earth's cultures. The old divisions began to heal under the conviction that only by sharing stories, by hearing one another's truths, could humanity remain free. This was not a utopia. There was still rebuilding to be done, wounds to heal, resources to restore. But a foundation of hope had been laid. Far beyond Earth, among drifting remnants of Marrakesh fleet, rumors indicated schisms in the empire. Entire sections of the lost colony turned against the tyrant, inspired by the very broadcast that had shaken Earth. Future historians would note that the downfall of an empire did not come from an armada of starfighters or nuclear brinkmanship, but from lines of poetry that reminded people of their own humanity. The abiding lesson was simple yet profound. Tyranny relies on silence, and stories ring with the voices of the living. In the rebuilding years, Althea, Francisco, Sankofa, Mina, and countless others traveled across continents, igniting dialogues, leading workshops where they taught children how to use words as well as any blade. They told ancient fables of heroes who overcame impossible odds. They performed new plays that dramatized the events of the occupation and the revolution, so no one would forget the horrors that happen when creativity is stifled. A day came when, during a worldwide festival in the once ruined amphitheater in Athens, Althea stood on stage to recite one final verse. The sun warmed the marble underfoot as thousands of listeners gathered in rapt attention. Some had journeyed for weeks across newly reopened borders, brimming with the hope of a new era. The verse she spoke was not an elegy, but a celebration. "We plant our words like seeds in soil once soaked with tears. From sorrow we summon new blossoms, from silence an uproar of praise. Their shadows came to chain our tongues, yet our voices rose, unstoppable. In each heart a new dawn glows, for we sing, forever free." She stepped back, letting the echo linger. The crowd erupted in applause and joyous tears, for in that moment they all understood. Earth had used nothing more than its poets, its storytellers, and the invincible call of language to topple an empire that had seemed unassailable. The planet was not safe from all future threats, but now it knew a powerful truth that no oppressor could take away. And so, on that day, mothers pressed copies of poems into their children's hands. Elders gathered youth around to pass on the stories by word of mouth. Performers from every corner of the globe danced and sang in a kaleidoscope of rhythms and choruses. Their songs, poems, and narratives carried the memory of what they had endured and catalyzed a resolute vow to remain vigilant against any who might seek to conquer them again. For as long as hearts beat and words could be shared, no tyrant's shadow would ever truly loom unchallenged. Humanity needed only a spark of brave creativity to remember its essence. In the end, not a bullet, not a bomb, but the mighty resonance of shared stories had forged a world reborn, ensuring that wherever darkness crept, it could be driven out by the bright flame of the human voice.